So let's get straight to it. We're going to talk about potential blackouts and the energy crisis, whether this is just scaremongering. It's interesting because Liz Truss has ruled out, as well as the fact that the National Grid is talking about this, Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, has ruled out launching an energy-saving public information campaign amid warnings about planned 3-hour blackouts that could be, keyword, could be imposed in some areas. So Jacob Rees-Mogg, he's now the Business Secretary, and he's believed to have backed a £15 million campaign to try to encourage people to switch off the lights, turn down their heating and things like that. But Liz Truss has said no, shouldn't be the nanny state. She, of course, is against the nanny state. Jacob Rees-Mogg is anti-nanny state, although, as we know, he is pro-nanny. Let's talk to Peter Edwards, who's the former editor of Labour List, and also Noah Khogali, who's a Conservative councillor, and he's also a political commentator with Young Voices UK. So should we be worried, or is this all scaremongering? I was accused yesterday on Jeremy's show of it being tabloid scaremongering and that we were just picking it up. So what is actually the truth? I should say also with Jeremy, let's remember that Jeremy Kyle Live, his brand new show, is going to be on air at 7 o'clock on Monday on TalkTV. So do tune in to that, and who knows, you might see a familiar face at some stage this week if you're very, very lucky indeed. So Jeremy Kyle Live, 7 o'clock. So let's talk to Peter and Noah. You're both very, very welcome to Talk TV this morning. How are you both?
Good morning, how are you?
Great, sunny day, yeah, how are you?
Yeah, it's a beautiful day, it's great. Let's go to Noah first and ask you, Noah, what do you make of what Liz Truss is saying, what Jacob Rees-Mogg is saying? Are we right to worry?
I don't think we're right to worry about blackouts. These kind of organisations, especially National Grid, are always going to make doomsday predictions because that's their job.
But they're not. The National Grid barely says anything. It barely tells us anything. And then suddenly they've come out and said, actually, the situation is really, really bad.
When everyone's talking about it, though, and it's, on the public mind, they have to talk about the plans they're making. Essentially, all they've done is said if the war in Ukraine takes a massive turn for the worse and Russia essentially switches off all of their gas and oil, then we might have a problem and we might need some blackouts. But that isn't realistic. They've said themselves that although it's possible, it's very, very, very improbable. And essentially what we've seen is this massive expansion of newspaper articles and social media, headliney clickbait to make people riled up.
Hold on a second. This is sorry, I just got to stop you there, Noah. You're talking about headliney clickbait. This is the National Grid. It's talking about a worst case scenario. It's saying this probably won't happen, but shouldn't we plan for the worst?
No, we absolutely should, but it's also not the National Grid, putting up articles about it every 5 minutes.
They put out the announcement. They put out the announcement. It is them. The original information has come from the National Grid.
Obviously, because it's their job to plan for it, but the media furore around it is entirely created because this is a really good way to grab people's attention. And honestly, I think what's ended up happening is lots of the media in this company is essentially helping Putin because what he really wants to do is instill fear across of Europe. And that's exactly what the media are helping him do now.
Okay, Peter Edwards, the media is just instilling fear, we're whipping everything up, we're panicking people, and we're saying this is all going to be terrible, and we're helping Vladimir Putin. What do you make of that?
I don't think the media have whipped it up at all, and I defend the role of tabloids, having worked for many of them over years. I think it's good to give the public information, especially when there's a problem potentially coming down the tracks, and I think if there's anyone's job in the whole country to worry about these type of things, is the National Grid. I'd be more worried if the National Grid had done the opposite and not published something and not looked down the track and thought about winter and energy supply and household bills and government action and so on. The fact that they've planned for it is completely sensible. And to give you one very, very brief parallel, you remember all those years back before the pandemic when the government didn't do planning for a pandemic. Now, to be fair, I'm not sure a pandemic would have been top of my list of things to worry about. I'd be more worried about the economy and terrorism. But David Cameron said, of course, we should have done more planning for the pandemic. It's not because one is predicting something like this is going to happen, but just because if there's a possibility, whether that possibility is 10% or much higher, it's sensible planning. So I don't think this is a foray, but of course it's a cause for concern.
It's sensible planning, says Peter Edwards. Noah, what do you make of that?
No, I agree it's sensible planning. I'd just also like to point out that it's completely untrue that the governments didn't plan for a pandemic. They did do that. Obviously, it took a very different form, but there always was that doomsday planning. It didn't turn out to be very helpful, it had an impact.
Boris Johnson didn't go to the first two Cobra meetings because he thought it was just SARS all over again, and we didn't need to worry too much about COVID.
David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister, said...
Sorry, one at a time, sorry. Noah first, then Peter. Noah, go ahead.
What I'm saying is the plans were still there, and it is right that the National Grid make those plans, but it is not right that we should go around the country terrifying people about something that is almost certainly not going to happen at a time when it's incredibly tough to live anyway.
So, Noah, in your view, speaking of COVID, the plan was there, so you believe the government dealt with COVID and lockdown correctly, do you?
No, I think obviously the plan was...
So they didn't follow the plan?
Doesn't mean there wasn't a plan in the first place. Just because
so it was a good plan or a bad plan?
Very well. It was a plan based on something that was not expected to be as bad, I don't think.
Okay. Peter, you were about to speak there. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think this is terrifying. I think governments have always got to treat the public as intelligent, wise people, even though not everyone has time to read a newspaper every day or watch all of the TV news and public service announcements. I'm very puzzled and concerned, and we're all using quite moderate language about Liz Truss refusing to spend £15 million on a public awareness campaign. I was just checking. Total public spending is around £1 trillion in the UK, not a billion, $1 trillion. We're talking about 15 million that is proportionately...
It is really not very much money at all, believe me. £15 million is not... I used to work in government for 3.5 years. £15 million is nothing.
Yeah, it's less than the cost of a ring road around one small town. So the idea that you spend a bit of money telling people that there's an issue coming down the tracks, here's how to be vigilant, here's how to manage your electricity, and have a benefit not just for oneself and one's own bill, but for the whole country by reducing the risk of blackouts.
Do people need to be told to switch off lights, Peter?
Well, I think people have been thinking about switching off lights in terms of their own bill.
So they don't need the public information campaign?
No, but there's a difference between switch your lights off to save a bit of money, which is welcome for most of us, and switch your lights off as part of a collective effort to ensure that the pressure on energy supply is a bit less, or we're less at risk for blackouts. And of course, as a left-wing person, I'm a bit more in favour of collective action and coming together, perhaps for a greater goal. But this is not just about one's own household bill, that is part of that. It's about the pool of energy that we've got to get us through what could be a tough winter.
Noah, Peter is making the point there that it probably makes sense to encourage people to turn their heating down. But surely when people see their energy bills, they will know to do that. Surely they don't need a £15 million public information campaign. What do you think, Noah?
No, exactly. I think lots of the left-wing commentariat especially seem to have this idea that the public aren't very bright, which is completely untrue. There's lots of people running around essentially spouting this nonsense that the public think that there is a complete cap on the amount of energy they can use, and they should just leave their ovens, their radiators, and all their lights on all the time because there's a maximum amount of money they're going to pay. They don't think that because they're not thick. That's very simple. The public will see when they are paying more for their electricity, they are bright enough to go, OK, maybe we should be a bit more careful about this. I've got no problem with the government saying, look, these are some things you can do to reduce your electricity, but they shouldn't be launching massive campaigns where they go, right, at 6 o'clock, everyone in the country should
But there's no suggestion that they were doing that. They're simply giving people, they would argue, the idea that Jacob Rees-Mogg signed off was simply to give people those kind of basic tips that you were talking about a second ago, Noah.
You can get that information already, and there's no problem with the government, providing that information, but you don't need to run. There was talk of televised campaigns, essentially telling people...
You're not going to get a big televised campaign for 15 million quid, let me tell you.
No, and this is why it's hard to, debate essentially the internal conversations that people are having in the cabinet. I think this other narrative that's, cropped up, that Liz Truss is this ardent anti-nanny statist, is also completely untrue. This is a government that already has spent ridiculous amounts of money, really importantly, on, trying to reduce people's energy bills, which she wouldn't do if she was this ardent libertarian that people keep characterising her as. There's obviously something more going on here. And what I would suggest is it's probably a discussion about whether you should tell people to turn off their lights or you should provide them that advice in a way that they can go and consume it if they want to, but they also have a certain amount of free will and can go about their lives without Liz Truss getting involved in it every day.
We're going to go to a break in a second, but Peter, I just want to hear a final word from you just before we go to the break. Both gents are going to very kindly stay on after the break, but a huge reaction to this. We're going to take calls, we've got text, tweets, etc. Let me just read a couple of texts here, and then I'll come to Peter for a final thought. Dan from Kent, morning, Peter. I think blackouts are very possible because we won't be able to afford energy if the books don't balance end of production. Alex in Norfolk says, Peter, you were both, I think Alex is referring to Jeremy Kyle and me, you were both scaremongering yesterday about the blackout. Not because of what you said, but about how you were almost hysterical in saying it despite it being unlikely. Like your commentary on the new government. It's over the top, panicky. You sound like a Tory-hating lefty. Please calm down. Alex, I literally worked for the Conservative Party for 3.5 years. I'm not sure I can be described as a Tory-hitting lefty, but there we are. I will try to calm down. Judy says, morning, Peter. The public have been made aware of scaremongering from both government and media to frighten people into submission. So as a result, we now have a division of those who will be permanently scared about the latest issue and those who don't believe anything they are told. They see it as scaremongering. It needs to stop. Linda says, Peter, your guest is talking, I'm not sure which guest, your guest is talking rubbish. The media is whipping up with the public as usual. The National Grid plans for this every year, but we never hear about this. Peter Edwards, what do you make of this? What do you make of what our listeners and viewers are saying this morning, Peter Edwards?
Well, I do disagree with it to a certain extent because I think there's a difference between information and terrifying people. You know, I've worked as a newspaper reporter where you're making these judgments every day.
Who did you work for, if you don't mind me asking, Peter?
Yeah, so I worked for City AM, which is a business paper in London, and then I worked for the Yorkshire Post and a few regional dailies around the UK that had
how carefully did you take your response? I'm sure you took them very carefully, but I mean, if there was something like this, if there was a kind of big story that could be interpreted as actually this is a terrible thing and all the rest of it, obviously we're talking about that today and Noah has thoughts on that and I have thoughts on that, but if there's something that's really, really serious, how seriously did you take your responsibility as a journalist, Peter?
Well, let me give you a quick example. So my first job as a trainee was in a small town, Carlisle, great place at the absolute far north of England, that had been hit by extremely bad floods over the last 20 years. When there was a big storm coming, you have to be very careful saying there's a big storm coming, there is some risk of flooding, and then you give a quote from the expert, not one's own opinion. And what you don't do is saying a flood is coming because you don't know that. And
absolutely.
Actually, the first time as a trainee, I did that. I came into work the next morning and there wasn't a drop of rain on the building. And that doesn't mean the story is wrong. It means you just give an estimation of what might happen without putting the wind up people. Someone did use a slightly ruder word than wind. Well,
indeed. I was always told as a journalist, if the story is sensational, there's no need to sensationalise it, which is often the case. Kieran has also been in touch. He says, the public have already been energy rationing for the last 2 years due to exorbitant energy price hikes. People are not running appliances for a laugh right now. I mean, that is the case, Noah, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that hits the nail on the head, is people are really struggling across the country. If you're going to these people and saying, oh, you should probably start saving electricity or saving energy now, that is incredibly condescending to people across the country who are doing that already. This is not something that is new to most people. It might be new in the Westminster bubble, but across, the real country with real people, this is something they've been very aware of for a long time.
Thank you both. We're talking to Peter Edwards, who's the former editor of Labour List. We're also talking to Noah Khogali, who is a Conservative councillor and a political commentator with Young Voices UK. We're going to continue the debate after the break.
Going on,
you make good points, Pat, and thank you so much for giving us a call. That's Pat in Suffolk there. He gave us a call on 0344 499 1000. Let's go back to our guests. We've got Peter Edwards, who's the former editor of Labour List, and Noah Khogali, who's a Conservative councillor, political commentator, and with Young Voices UK. Guys, I just want to read you one message, particularly in reference to Peter here. Lefty Peter wants a collective effort. Cue neighbours reporting people for having their lights on. The left do like to stir trouble and divide. Peter, your reaction to that?
Well, I'll maybe take that as a joke, given I didn't say most of that. I think I did utter the word collective, and that's part of my values. And we saw that in the pandemic, because there are one or two parallels with a different crisis. Remember all the rules of the pandemic and things like wearing a mask. That wasn't to keep oneself safe. That was to keep other people safe in case you were spreading something unwittingly. I think that's maybe the principle behind pooling energy and having these blackouts. And we've got to be clear, no one wants a blackout. It's going to be inconvenient and possibly dangerous for some people if they've got chronic health problems and need to use medical conditions. But we are in an energy crisis. We know that while the roots, I believe, are firmly with the British government, Putin's evil actions in Eastern Europe make it an even bigger crisis, and we don't know when that will come to an end. So it is a time to come together, help each other about, and maybe just think, as a lot of your callers are doing, a little bit more carefully about our energy usage. But we do that through encouragement and advice, not through lectures or laws.
Okay, final word on all of this. Noah, you're looking confused and you're smiling at some of the stuff Peter's saying. Final word from you, please, on all of this. By the way, on the mask point, Peter, thank you for your thoughts there, but I can think of at least one person who would disagree with you, and her name is Julia Hartley-Brewer. Noah, thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, I think my question would be how the UK government is responsible for an international energy crisis and for this risk of Putin essentially.
But now come on, Noah. The UK government definitely has a responsibility for our own energy security. They have a role in this, if it's not entirely their responsibility overall.
We basically get no gas and oil from Russia anyway. This is the international energy markets that are the problem here, not necessarily the UK government. And it is entirely disingenuous to suggest that if we did end up in a worst case scenario having blackouts, that would be entirely because Putin ended up taking a drastic measure, which I probably don't think he's going to do. But that would be entirely
I don't think anybody's suggesting that. I don't think Peter's suggesting that. Is that what you picked up from what he said?
I mean, he did say that it was mostly because of the UK government and, the Ukraine war was an afterthought. But that is what I mean. As what I said at the very, very beginning of this, that this is essentially the left-wing commentariat trying to have a pot shot at the government over something that is very, very unlikely to happen and are terrifying the country for no reason.
Peter, a final thought. I know I said final thought previously, but you've shaken your head a couple of times, so I will just briefly come back to you, and then I think we need to end the discussion. But Peter, go ahead and respond just to what Noah was saying there.
Well, I'm just giving the facts, and Noah sounds a bit rattled, using a lot of personal language. But I think perhaps the other Peter and I come from different traditions politically. But Theresa May cut our gas reserves, and I think whether you're talking about the fuel crisis under Tony Blair, or austerity, or the state of the NHS, the government is responsible for keeping the country going, and that includes planning for force majeure, i.e. a few surprises. So all roads lead back to the government, and that's why I think the election will be on a lot of, are you better off or are you worse off than 5 years ago?
Folks, you're both brilliant commentators. Thank you very much indeed. That was Peter Edwards, former editor of the Labour List, and Noah Khogali, who is a Conservative councillor, political commentator with Young Voices UK, and if I can say so, has perhaps the best eyebrows as a commentator on TalkTV. Although Richard Power Saeed, I don't know, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. Maybe we need to have an eyebrow off between them. They're two great men with two great sets of eyebrows, as is Peter Edwards. No comment on his eyebrows. Anyway, we're going to have a paper review in just a short minute or two.